June 4, 1942, North Pacific. Aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi observes the sea with meticulous confidence. According to his calculations, there are only 2 American aircraft carriers left. One of them, the Yorktown, had already been sunk weeks earlier in the Coral Sea. The math of victory was consolidated, but the math failed. At 10:20 a.m., Japanese observers detect a third wave of American bombers, more aircraft than 2 ships could launch. And then, among the smoke, someone recognizes the silhouette, the same deck, the same island structure, the same visual signature. The Yorktown was back. This reappearance was not only unexpected, it was impossible, under the laws of Japanese naval engineering. But the Pacific War would not be won by honor doctrines or ceremonial timelines. It would be decided by a force that Japan could not measure: industrial speed. This documentary chronicles how a single aircraft carrier, declared dead, was resurrected within 72 hours, and how that feat, born of crooked welds, overlapping plates, and desperate decisions, redefined what power meant in modern warfare. When the Japanese saw the Yorktown at Midway, they understood too late. They were not fighting ships. They were fighting against a system capable of transforming the impossible into protocol. But before we dive behind the scenes of this feat, there is one statistic that defines this whole story. According to Japanese naval doctrine, it would take a bomb-hit aircraft carrier at least 3 months to return to combat. The Yorktown was repaired in exactly 72 hours. 3 days. 72 hours that redefined a battle, a war, and perhaps the very concept of military superiority in the 20th century. A single American aircraft carrier reappearing where it should no longer exist. This isn't just a story about engineering. It's about colliding mentalities. On the one hand, ceremonial perfectionism. On the other, the industrial urgency that transforms crooked steel into firepower. If you value detailed history, rigorous research, and the courage of those who struggled with impossible welds and deadlines, consider leaving your like and subscribing to the channel. Your support keeps that memory alive and allows us to continue revealing the numbers that changed the world. To the Japanese High Command, the Battle of Midway was a problem solved before it had even begun. Naval intelligence reports, based on radio intercepts, aerial observations, and doctrinal extrapolations, confirmed the Americans had only 2 operational aircraft carriers in the Pacific, USS Enterprise and USS Hornet. Saratoga was still under repair off the west coast, and Yorktown, after severe damage in the Coral Sea, had been ruled out. Japanese analysis was not lax. It was mathematical. In his logic, a vessel with a perforated deck, damaged boilers, and structural leaks would take, at best, 90 days to return to the front line. Based on this premise, the plan for Operation MI was designed with Cartesian precision. 4 aircraft carriers of the 1st Air Fleet would face 2 enemies inferior in number, range, and morale. The organization of the missions, the load of armaments, the patrol shifts, and even the amount of fuel shipped were conditioned by the certainty that they would face a reduced force. It was a war based on assumptions, and none of them foresaw the impossible. Japanese confidence has become a structure. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the operation, defined an offensive formation based on initial air supremacy. The Japanese Fleet Strike Group would be divided into 2 waves, one to crush Midway's shore defenses, the other kept on alert to react to enemy carriers. The reasoning was logical. Americans would come, but they would come weak. Aboard the Akagi, the fleet's flagship, Admiral Nagumo reviewed the takeoff and recovery schemes. It all depended on response time and airspace dominance in the first 30 minutes of combat. The doctrine of the Imperial Navy was clear. When the enemy proves predictable, victory becomes a function of discipline. And discipline was not lacking in the Japanese. What was missing, and they didn't know yet, was flexibility. The Japanese operated with millimetric efficiency. Its hangars were filled with carefully aligned bombers, 0 fighters calibrated to the last screw, and a crew highly trained to rearm, refuel, and relaunch aircraft in less than 15 minutes. However, this accuracy depended on predictability. It was a closed, hermetic system, optimized for scenarios predicted in advance. When the first American aircraft appeared on Japanese radars on the morning of June 4th, the reaction was swift, but not suspicious. The lookout reports confirmed the approach of enemy planes from the northeast. They were expected. It was the beginning of the confrontation, exactly as the plan foresaw. The attack on Midway had already been launched, and the second wave was only awaiting the order to reconfigure for an air counterattack. No alarm sounded beyond what was expected, until the numbers started not to add up. A group of lookouts aboard the Kaga reported the presence of multiple squadrons approaching simultaneously from different directions. The first assumption was that Enterprise and Hornet had launched all of their aircraft at once, but the number exceeded the operational standard of these two ships. More than 50 aircraft were on their way, and there were still other formations being detected to the south. The attack pattern did not match the logic of two aircraft carriers. The rhythm, cadence, and vectors indicated that there was a third element in the field, a ship that, by Japanese calculations, could not exist there. At this point, what the officers of the Imperial Navy ignored was the simple difference in concept that divided the two forces. While Japan was guided by doctrinal projections based on honor and hierarchical structure, the United States had learned, painfully and urgently, that modern warfare required elasticity. What the Japanese called impossible, the Americans called necessary. The Yorktown had been repaired in 72 hours, an inconceivable time for Japanese naval engineers, whose doctrine called for dismantling, inspecting, replacing, and testing each section hit before releasing a ship for combat. Here it is worth pausing for a statistic that the Japanese never imagined facing. In 1942, the United States was able to build an Essex-class aircraft carrier from scratch in less than a year, while Japan took, on average, 2.5 years. American steel production was 10 times higher. Its industrial conversion capacities, from civilian to military factories, exceeded the speed of Japan by 20 times. If this difference in scale surprises you, comment below with "logistics wins" or "absolute power." This helps the channel understand who values the data that history has tried to ignore. Back on the deck of the Hiryu, Admiral Yamaguchi began to feel the change in the air. The presence of more aircraft than anticipated generated a statistical noise that could no longer be ignored, and the doubt planted in the middle of Japanese protocol began to erode the core of tactical confidence. Was Yorktown there? If it were, the entire plan would have been built on a false absence, and with that, the doctrine of the Imperial Navy lost its basis of support, because it did not foresee improvisation. He did not contemplate the absurd, and she certainly wasn't ready to fight a force that turned the absurd into a pattern. In the next few minutes, the Japanese fleet would face a truth that no calculation had predicted, because while the Japanese bet on certainties, the Americans bet on solutions. When the dauntless bombers plunged out of the sky with their targets already set, the Japanese commanders would have only seconds to understand that the biggest mistake had been not tactical, nor air, but philosophical. And it all started when Yorktown reappeared. The question now was inevitable. What else was America capable of doing? And how soon? May 8, 1942. Coral Sea. The open sky. The perfect visibility. At 10:32 a.m., 18 Japanese Aichi D-3A VAL model dive bombers dive over a target visible more than 10 nautical miles away. The USS Yorktown. The attack is meticulously coordinated, led by Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi. The 250-kilogram bombs are dropped with precision over the ship's centerline. One of them hits the flight deck near the island structure and penetrates 5 decks below before exploding. The other, with a secondary impact effect, tears through side compartments, destroying critical equipment. Black smoke rises immediately. Oil leaks spread across the surface. The vessel lists visibly to port, reducing its speed to less than 6 knots. The scene is recorded by reconnaissance cameras and the watchful eyes of Japanese pilots. The photos show active fires, lateral destruction, and destroyers approaching to rescue survivors. For the operational logic of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was not just a successful attack. It was an operational closure. The Yorktown had been neutralized with damage that, by its own standards, would have required 3 months of dry dock, at a minimum. Admiral Takeo Takagi sends the final report to headquarters in Tokyo. 2 American aircraft carriers have been destroyed. The Lexington sank hours after the attack. The Yorktown, by Japanese images and estimates, had lost all capacity for recovery and air operations. The Emperor is informed. The Imperial Navy celebrates. The ciphered messages exchanged between the naval groups consolidate the certainty that the Pacific was finally about to be dominated. Most importantly, the calculations for the next offensive, Midway, would be based on this conclusion. Yorktown had been erased from the equation. But this illusion of victory was about to face its first challenge. Aboard the Yorktown, even with the brutal impact of the explosions, the damage control team sprang into action with a speed that ignored the manuals. Captain Elliot Buckmaster remained on the gangway, commanding fire containment and damage assessment in real time. The bomb that penetrated 5 decks killed 66 men instantly. Compartments were destroyed. Vital equipment such as aircraft lifts were rendered useless. 3 boiler rooms were damaged. The flight deck was deformed. The contaminated fuel was spread over 30 structural frames. But despite the image of destruction, the hull remained intact. The engines, with effort, kept the ship at 20 knots, and the steering system still responded. What the Japanese called total destruction was actually a state of functional damage. For American damage control doctrine, it didn't matter how perfect the repair was. It mattered whether the ship could keep fighting. The cultural difference was profound. While Japanese naval engineering required complete dismantling, thorough inspection, and replacement with original parts, the U.S. Navy already operated under the philosophy of total adaptability. If one piece was destroyed, another would be relocated. If the standard cable path was compromised, it would be rerouted over the deck. If the manual required a 30-day process, the time would be forcibly compressed with continuous labor. The Yorktown proceeded to Pearl Harbor, cruising 3,300 nautical miles in 19 days. The Japanese, intercepting ciphered transmissions indicating the position of a damaged carrier, assumed that it was sailing at reduced speed, from 5 to 8 knots. His estimates put the arrival in mid-June, too late for any repairs before the Midway offensive, scheduled for the 4th. This assumption would seal the fate of the Japanese fleet. The error was not visual. The pilots saw, in fact, destruction. The mistake was cultural. The Japanese projected their own doctrine on the enemy. They thought that the Americans thought like them, that the honor lay in completely restoring a ship before returning it to combat, that the rules of engineering were immutable. But what they didn't know is that Americans thought like factories. They thought like assembly lines. They thought in terms of a solution. Unlike the Japanese technical hierarchy, where each repair had to be approved in a chain, the Americans granted autonomy to the onboard engineers. The mentality was pragmatic. If it floats, it works. If you shoot, you fight. During the crossing to Pearl Harbor, Yorktown crews improvised a series of emergency solutions. Steel plates were welded directly onto damaged structures. Machinery spaces were sealed with wood, concrete, and even cement from the airstrip. Electrical systems were redesigned with external wiring, crossing bulkheads and hatches. Each makeshift repair carried the same goal: to keep the ship alive right up to the dock. On arrival in Hawaii on May 27th, Yorktown presented a functionally haunting portrait. It leaked fuel, trembled as it sailed, spewed smoke from side crevices, but it still operated. It was still carrying aircraft, and more importantly, it could still be used. That evening, when personally inspecting the damage, Admiral Chester Nimitz did not ask for a technical diagnosis. He asked only one question: how soon did we get it back? And when he received the standard answer, 90 days, he replied with the only sentence that really mattered: I need him in 3. The answer would seal the next chapter of this story, because the war would not be won by calculations. It would be won by decision. Japan believed it had destroyed the Yorktown, but at Pearl Harbor, the greatest logistical refutation of World War II was already beginning to be born. A 72-hour operation that would change the course of the war. And that, in its center, it would have 1,400 civilian workers with blowtorches in their hands, and no permission to fail, aboard the USS Yorktown, the sound of steel crackling under pressure, mingled with the smell of burning oil and steam. The Japanese bombs had pierced 5 decks, destroyed vital compartments, rendered the central aircraft elevator unusable, and seriously damaged the boiler rooms. But the hull still responded. The engines were still turning, and the bridge was still giving orders. What Japanese observers reported as a drifting ship, barely getting 6 knots, was moving at a steady 20 knots toward Hawaii. This discrepancy between appearance and performance was not accidental. It was the direct result of a doctrine that ignored technical perfectionism in favor of raw adaptability. While Japanese calculations estimated that the Yorktown would not even be able to reach Pearl Harbor in time to be repaired before the next offensive began, the ship was already cutting across the Pacific with a mindset that defied traditional naval logic. Functioning was more important than looking intact. During the 19-day crossing, the crew executed a silent operation of survival and improvised engineering. Flooded compartments were sealed with repurposed steel plates. Leaks were contained with materials that would never have been part of a technical manual. Shoring wood, fast cement, caulking resin used in civilian docks. Electrical cables were run outside the destroyed corridors, hanging between bulkheads like exposed veins. Ventilation systems were rerouted using dismantled pipes from secondary compartments. Every crew action ignored conventional repair protocols, prioritizing survivability and minimal combat functionality. The goal was not to restore, it was to endure. The contrast with Japanese doctrine could not be more radical. In Japanese naval engineering, each part of a ship represented an extension of national honor. An injury required not only substitution, but technical ritual. Japanese shipyards were temples of precision, operating calmly and reverently, as if each weld contained the spirit of the vessel. Yorktown, on the other hand, crossed the ocean like a wounded machine, kept alive by a brutally pragmatic philosophy. If it can make it work, it is ready to fight. No American officer expected a full recovery on the high seas, but no one considered withdrawal as an acceptable option either. Internal reports from the U.S. Navy reveal that even with the damage sustained, the Yorktown retained 85% of its maneuverability and 60% of its air capability. The power supply was restored in 3 of the 4 main circuits. The fuel tanks, although partially contaminated by fire oil, still provided enough pressure to keep the engines in continuous operation. Under normal conditions, such damage would have condemned the ship to months in the shipyard, but World War II was not a normal scenario. The high-speed crossing demonstrated more than resilience. It demonstrated a new American doctrine emerging in the heat of urgency. Each day at sea, shipboard officers received engineering progress reports with the same logic as a production line. Reinforced temporary sealing. Alternative electrical system running at 68% power. Radar partially restored with repurposed parts. These notes were not impressive aesthetically, but operationally, they signified the rebirth of the ship before it even reached the dry dock. And while sailing injured, the Yorktown remained a flight platform. Planes landed and took off in controlled exercises. Pilots practiced emergency maneuvers. Nothing stopped. The Japanese High Command, for its part, did not consider this possibility. The intercepted transmissions indicated the presence of an American ship moving east, but the analyses assumed reduced speed, based on their own doctrinal standards. If the Yorktown was on its way to Pearl Harbor, it was said, it would not arrive until June 15th. It was too late. The Japanese offensive against Midway would take place on June 4th. The assumption was taken as safe, and precisely for this reason, it was never verified. As it approached the Pearl Harbor Naval Base on the night of May 27th, the Yorktown exhaled smoke through openings in the hull. The oil slick he left behind was visible from Diamond Head. The exhausted crew, who had not slept full shifts for days, kept the ship in operational silence without ceremony, without announcement. When he docked, he was greeted with incredulous eyes, not for his presence per se, but for the state in which he had arrived. He was still floating. He still had guns. He could still fight. The next morning, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, toured the ship in person. His boots sank into pools of oil as he inspected the warped decks. His uniform was tarnished when he touched the partially welded sides, but he asked no questions about the damage. He just looked at Engineering Captain Claude Gillette and Lieutenant Commander H.J. Feinstad, who was in charge of structural repairs, and said, "We need it ready in 3 days." It was not a request. It was a new reality imposing itself. The response was not immediate. No one in their right mind thought it was possible to repair an aircraft carrier in 72 hours. But the enemy would not wait. More importantly, American intelligence operating from Station Hypo already knew the date of the Japanese attack. Midway would start in 4 days. The question was no longer whether the Yorktown could be repaired. The question now was what the Americans were willing to do to get him back to fighting. That decision, sealed there, on the warped deck of a ship on the verge of collapse, would mark the beginning of the most extraordinary repair operation of World War II, a feat that would not only surprise the Japanese, but that would redefine the concept of global military readiness. Time was against them. But America had something Japan lacked, a workforce trained in the impossible and driven by absolute urgency. And by the dawn of the next day, 1,400 men were marching toward Dry Dock No. 1. The morning of May 28th dawned muggy at Pearl Harbor. Dry Dock No. 1 was already in preparation when Admiral Chester Nimitz personally arrived at the dock. With his pants wet to his knees and his expression charged with urgency, he walked every inch of the Yorktown, now completely immobilized. The scene was symbolic. The commander of the Pacific Fleet walking on a crooked deck, between still smoldering bomb holes and heat-twisted cables. Alongside the shipyard's chief engineers, Nimitz asked the question that would change the course of the operation. How many days to get it ready? The answer came quickly, and predictably, at least 90 days. Nimitz didn't hesitate. So we have 72 hours. The phrase reverberated like a torpedo among the officers. No one there had repaired a ship in 3 days, and no one had been trained for that. But at that moment it was no longer about deadlines. It was about avoiding an imminent strategic disaster. Nimitz's decision was not impulsive. It was driven by invisible data. About 100 meters away, in a windowless building protected by armed soldiers, was Hypo Station, the intelligence center of the U.S. Navy. There, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptologists had deciphered the Imperial Japanese Navy's communication codes weeks earlier, and what they discovered was definitive. Operation MI was a surprise attack on Midway Island, scheduled for June 4th. The information was no longer a guess, it was certainty. Japan was coming in full force, and the only way to balance the confrontation was with 3 aircraft carriers, not 2. 3. Yorktown needed to be ready, even if it was patched up, even if it was unstable, even if logic said otherwise. From an industrial point of view, the challenge was abysmal. The Yorktown had damage to 3 decks, 2 inoperable aircraft elevators, faulty radar systems, fuel leaks in multiple compartments, and critical failures in her boilers and ventilation. Naval protocols required inspections, pressure tests, replacement of original parts, and systems checks before any attempt at reactivation. But the protocol was set aside. What emerged there was something that only Americans mastered naturally: the art of improvising under pressure on an industrial scale. The shipyard was reorganized as a battlefield. In less than 6 hours, more than 1,400 civilian and military workers were allocated to uninterrupted 12-hour shifts. Divided into repair zones, they acted as if they were on an assembly line. Hull welders on the morning shift, electricians on the night shift, plumbers and structural engineers covering every night. There was no time for technical discussion. Each sector received direct and objective orders per hour. Is the ventilation system damaged? They used repurposed pipes from an abandoned cargo ship. Flooded compartments? They were sealed with emergency welding and filled with naval cement. Burnt electrical cables? They were replaced by whole rolls extracted from reserves at Hickam Field Air Force Base. The physical and human impact of this decision was not small. Civilian workers, many between the ages of 16 and 60, worked non-stop, with relays forced by exhaustion. Supervisors were allowed to break any safety regulations, as long as the calculated risk resulted in time gains. Every 6 hours, the Admiralty received progress reports, and surprisingly, the numbers were advancing. Within 24 hours, more than 40% of the critical structures had been sealed. Within 48 hours, the propulsion systems were reactivated, and by the end of the 3rd day, the Yorktown, though still healed, was operational again. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Not in manuals, but in grease-smeared hands and decisions that ignored the impossible. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts that traditional history rarely shows, show your support, like and subscribe. This helps us to continue bringing this kind of technical, human, and hidden content behind the scenes of the war. This repair operation, now studied in naval academies as an extreme example of readiness under pressure, revealed something even more profound: the birth of a new doctrine. It was no longer enough to have ships. It was necessary to have a system that could get them back into action before the enemy noticed. Japan still believed it was facing American ships, but what it faced, in fact, was a logistical, industrial, and informational complex that responded with speed, flexibility, and intelligence. A system that transformed twisted iron into a counterattack vector in 72 hours. And now, with the Yorktown about to set sail again, there was only one question left in the air. Would the Japanese be ready to face a ship that, by their logic, could no longer exist? The USS Yorktown floated in the dry dock like a scarred body before surgery. The hull still wet, the deck deformed, the elevators creaking under the pressure of temporary patches. In any traditional naval manual, that ship would be technically doomed. But the United States was no longer following playbooks. What was happening there was the consecration of a new philosophy of war, one that depended not on perfection, but on adaptation. Every decision made by the engineers and workers at Pearl Harbor in the 3 days of repair was, in practice, an act of technical insubordination. Welds applied on layers of damaged steel, not to restore the original structure, but to keep it together for another mission. Electrical cables run outside the hull, visible, exposed to rain and heat, but fully functional. Internal panels replaced by wooden planks from civil construction. The naval aesthetic had been sacrificed. Functionality does not. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, viewed a ship as an extension of national identity. Cutting, replacing, rebuilding to perfection was not only necessary, but mandatory. A damaged aircraft carrier required a return to the mother dock, complete dismantling, rigorous inspections, and reconstruction to immaculate standards. For Japanese engineers, operating with failures was desecrating the vessel. For Americans, to operate with failures was to overcome them. This difference was not just technical, it was philosophical. While Japan prepared its fleet for the ideal scenario, the United States trained its fleet for the worst-case scenario. And the worse the scenario, the more adaptable the system became. At Yorktown, the hallmarks of this mentality were visible in every hatch. The bomb that had destroyed 5 decks was insulated with a steel plate welded at 4 points, supported by repurposed civilian scaffolding. The elevators, with no time for structural maintenance, were manually leveled and kept operational by improvised counterweight mechanisms. The radar, whose main antenna had been rendered useless, was recalibrated with parts extracted from a fighter jet stationed at Iwa Field Air Force Base. The auxiliary engines were fed by provisional fuel lines, diverted directly from the central tanks with emergency valves. There was no symmetry, no elegance, but everything worked. Lieutenant Commander Ralph Curry, in charge of the ship's power section, recorded in his diary, "This ship will never be beautiful again, but he will fight. And that's all that matters right now." The same logic was applied to anti-aircraft defense. Some guns were misaligned. Others operated manually due to lack of electricity. And even so, they were calibrated by eye, with practical testing done in the port itself, shooting at simulated buoys. Nothing went through a committee. Urgency replaced protocol. Trust replaced the manual. Japan, for its part, did not imagine this type of approach. Its engineering centered on the idea that technical failures reflected moral failures. The ideal ship was the symbol of national honor, its appearance a reflection of the dignity of the empire. An improvised ship, patched up, reused, was unthinkable. But it was exactly this ship that was about to set sail. The Yorktown, deformed, patched and oil-stained but functional, left the dry dock 72 hours after its arrival. Meanwhile, the Japanese remained trapped in the certainty that he was out of combat. This contradiction revealed something bigger. It wasn't just Yorktown that had been rebuilt. It was the very idea of how to win a modern war. The United States had integrated 3 invisible vectors into a single act: cryptographic intelligence, logistical improvisation, and industrial scale. What Japan saw as dishonor, the Americans translated as survival. And at that moment, survival was the only language that mattered. On the evening of May 30th, Yorktown departed again. There was no ceremony. There was no speech. Just a war-stained ship returning to it in a hurry. One of the civil engineers, upon seeing the aircraft carrier disappear over the horizon, said the phrase that would become famous in the shipyard's archives: "It doesn't look pretty, but it will fool someone." He would deceive, in fact. Within days, it would reappear before the eyes of Japanese commanders who believed they had sunk it, a sight that would collapse the logic of the war they thought they controlled. But before the Yorktown launched its planes against the Imperial fleet, it would have to withstand something even more critical: the first real clash, with the structure still fragile, with improvised systems against precision bombers. Would the ship be ready, or would haste be his sentence? The answer would come with the first alarms on the radar and the low dives on the horizon. Pearl Harbor, in May 1942, was no longer a simple naval base. It was a living organism, pulsating steel, steam, and urgency every minute. Since the Japanese attack in December of the previous year, the Hawaiian archipelago had ceased to be a strategic outpost and had become the logistics epicenter of the Pacific. The entire geography of the island responded to one function: hangars converted into propeller factories, school gymnasiums adapted as welding centers, entire neighborhoods functioning as rotating dormitories for workers working 16-hour shifts. The war was no longer fought only by pilots and sailors. It was fueled by locksmiths, welders, electricians, plumbers, porters, and toolmakers who, even without uniforms, carried the gravity of the mission in their eyes. Every hammer to the Yorktown's hull was a blow against the timer of defeat, and for every spark thrown by a poorly aligned weld, another second was bought for the future of the American fleet. The Pearl Harbor shipyard operated as a makeshift assembly line. The orders didn't just come from the Navy, they came from necessity. When Yorktown docked, power consumption was so high that it caused temporary blackouts in civilian neighborhoods on the island. Hospitals had to use generators. Radio stations shut down. The workmen surrounding the ship's hull operated in extreme heat, shrouded in smoke, with makeshift mess halls between sections of the deck. Many ate with tools in their hands, sitting on freshly welded steel plates, sweating and eating next to sparks. There was no break. There was no silence. The roar of the machines was constant, as if the ship itself was being revived with screams. Bureaucracy was abolished by urgency. Materials were requisitioned without paperwork. Wood intended for civil construction was repurposed to reinforce internal structures. Parts taken from partially dismantled ships were adapted with minimal compatibility. Everything that served was used. Everything that got in the way was discarded. The parts didn't have to be the original model. They just needed to fit. And if they didn't fit, they would be molded with sledgehammers. American engineering at that time ceased to be a science and became an art of war, the art of improvising under pressure. The ultimate symbol of this mentality came when engineers discovered that one of the main plates on the starboard side was unrecoverable. Replacing it would mean dismantling half of the hull, something unfeasible in 3 days. The solution came from a civilian welder named Richard "Rick" Leary. Used 2 smaller overlapping plates, cross-welded and side-reinforced with repurposed railroad tracks. The technique had never been tested, but at that moment, it was enough to work. When asked if it would withstand the sea, Rick replied, "It's not going to win a design award, but it's going to float. And if it has to, it's going to shoot." The phrase went around the shipyard, became an inside joke. Later, it became a motto. More than 2,400 civilians participated in the operation. Many worked without knowing the extent of the mission. They only knew that time was critical. Among them, dozens of immigrants, descendants of Japanese, Italians, and Germans who had offered to show with sweat which side they were on. There were former car mechanics, commercial shipbuilders, refinery workers, and even a 67-year-old retiree who had returned to work after losing his son at Pearl Harbor. These men, and some women, would not go down in the history books, but without them, Yorktown would never have returned to sea. It was these anonymous faces that sustained the industrial machinery of the American war. Unlike the European model, based on technical excellence and skilled labor, the United States operated with volume, rapid training, and standardization. A welder might not know the theory behind the thermal resistance of marine steel, but he mastered it enough to seal a compartment in 30 minutes, and that was all that mattered. Modern warfare did not require perfection. It required scale, cadence, and continuity, and the Pearl Harbor shipyard was the crude embodiment of that doctrine. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Germanic thought still breathed the ideal of the perfect machine, the weapon designed to last 100 years, the ship treated as a work of naval art. But in the Pacific, the war gave no time for beauty. There was only time for survival, and the Yorktown, stitched together by calloused hands, slowly climbed the channel to the bay. Still smoldering, but with the propellers spinning and the radars reactivated. It was ugly, but he was alive. And for the Japanese, that would be a problem. Because the truth is that Japan has not only underestimated the American Navy, it has underestimated the American worker. He underestimated the common citizen who welded without sleep, who carried sheets under the 40-degree sun, who put screws where they did not fit and made them fit. This invisible force was not counted in intelligence reports. He did not appear in naval maneuvers. But it was she who, in the end, decided who returned to the sea. And now, with the Yorktown ready for combat, the gear that Japan could not understand was about to show its true weapon, planes taking off from a ship that should no longer exist. On the morning of May 30th, 1942, the sun rose over Pearl Harbor with a glow that wasn't just from the Pacific. It was reflected in the jagged metals of the hull of the USS Yorktown, now partially recomposed. As sirens wailed in the shipyard, the carrier began to move, propelled by boilers that had been nearly torn from the bottom of the ship 4 days earlier. Civilian workers were still on board, finishing the last patches as the ship picked up speed. Some descended by ropes straight to support boats. Others continued welding until the last minutes, leaving behind parts, tools, sweat, and silence. Yorktown did not leave with pomp. He left in a hurry, and he set out with purpose. On the deck, the signs of improvisation were visible. The original Yorktown Air Group had been virtually disbanded after the Coral Sea. Their planes destroyed, its pilots redeployed. The solution was to set up an emergency squad. Pilots of the USS Saratoga, still undergoing maintenance, were hastily deployed. Planes were borrowed from the USS Enterprise and even from training camps on the mainland. Aircraft of different models with different paint patterns were hastily arranged. It was a squadron made up of pilots who had never flown together, planes that had never been calibrated together. But they were there, and they knew one thing. Time was up. The USS Yorktown, now carrying this makeshift squadron, crossed the Pacific as a patched-up unit, but with a new identity. Communication between the bridge and the air crew was done with adapted codes, as many of the new pilots did not know the ship's standard signals. Some catapults operated at reduced power. The elevators, while functional, still shook with each climb. But even so, the ship took off planes, and it landed, and he was ready for combat. The American invisible doctrine, which favored functionality over purity, was literally taking off. As Yorktown approached the American task force in the Pacific, radios began to pick up his signature, first as an echo, then as a confirmation. The ship that had been reported lost reappeared between the formations. The crews of the other carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, watched the arrival as if they were seeing a ghost. Some sailors greeted, others shouted, others just stood silent, looking at the vessel still charred, but sailing with dignity. On the deck of the Enterprise, an officer recorded in his diary, "If he has returned, then anything is possible." Logic at that moment, bent on persistence. For Americans, the sight of Yorktown restored hope. For the Japanese, who were still operating with the certainty of their destruction, the ship represented a catastrophic failure of assumption, a failure that wasn't just one of intelligence, it was one of mentality. What the Japanese could not understand was that the Americans had integrated something they had not mastered, systematized improvisation, the ability to transform disorder into doctrine. And this doctrine now sailed at 25 knots, armed, equipped, and willing to fight. And there is a statistical detail that few Japanese analysts of the time took into account. In 1942, while Japan produced about 60 aircraft per month, the United States produced more than $2,000 every month. And this difference did not stop at manufacturing. The ability to train pilots to recover parts to repair ships in record time was part of an ecosystem that could not be measured by traditional naval tactics. If this disparity surprises you, leave a phrase in the comments that represents the impact of this reality. Absolute power. Unbelievable. Logistics wins. History, after all, is made up of those numbers that few have seen, and that changed everything. Yorktown was now heading for the most decisive battle of the Pacific War, but it was not the same ship that had left Pearl Harbor months earlier. It was, in essence, a new symbol, a ship that defied the concept of readiness. That proved that war no longer belonged to those who hoped to be ready, but to those who fought with what they had, and with what they made it work. Ahead, Midway Island awaited, and Japanese eyes were about to find the impossible. Because for them, the Yorktown was sunk, and now he was flying. Aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, the nerve center of the MI operation, the silence was only broken by coded transmissions and the constant noise of catapults launching aircraft. The Japanese admirals were confident. The logic was irrefutable. According to intelligence reports, only 2 American aircraft carriers remained operational, the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. The Yorktown, badly hit in the Coral Sea, had been declared a total loss. This absence was incorporated into the architecture of the Japanese plan, shaping every detail with mathematical precision. Air squadrons were distributed based on this certainty. The reserves of torpedo boats and fighters, calculated to face 2 flight covers. The attacks would be staggered, alternating focus between Midway's defenses and the supposed remaining American fleet. Japan believed it was facing a predictable, unbalanced, vulnerable force, just as it had planned. Japanese doctrine, centered on sequential efficiency, depended on absolute control of the time and position of enemies, and at that moment, everything seemed to be falling into place. The island of Midway was already under bombardment. The reconnaissance patrol had not detected any unexpected movements, and the first squadrons returned to the Akagi, with reports of satisfactory progress. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the task force, remained faithful to the plan, reorganized the planes for a second wave of attack, regain air dominance, consolidate the victory. The logic was impeccable until the moment it ceased to be. At 07:55 a.m., Al-Akagi lookouts reported the approach of multiple American formations. The number of aircraft seemed high. Initially, the Japanese assumed that this was a concentrated effort by Midway's forces, but it soon became clear. The flight patterns, the types of aircraft, the tactical formations indicated takeoff from aircraft carriers. More specifically, 3. The equation was beginning to fail. The number of planes in the air did not match the 2 ships predicted in the reports. Someone had returned to the battle, but who? Inside the Akagi Command Center, tension has grown. Operations analysts began to recalculate the distribution of enemy forces. The encrypted messages indicated the presence of squadrons with calling codes that did not belong to the Enterprise or the Hornet. The answer hung in the air, but no one dared to say it. Yorktown was back, and if that were true, the entire architecture of the MI plan would collapse. The torpedo boat reserve was poorly positioned. The cover fighters were divided. The support ships too far away to react quickly. And more important, Japan now faced an equal, or superior, force. The Japanese belief in doctrinal accuracy had engendered blind trust. Since the beginning of the war, Japan had won by anticipating the enemy's movements and imposing its technical superiority. Its aircraft carriers were faster, its torpedo boats more lethal, its pilots more experienced. But none of this would make up for a fundamental mistake: underestimating the American ability to reconstitute forces in real time. Japanese intelligence, hitherto effective, had failed to understand not only the volume of U.S. industry, but its speed of response. It was no longer a war of positioning, it was a war of adaptation. Commander Minoru Genda, architect of the attack plan, would record years later, "We did not count on the fact that the Americans fought as if they had a factory behind each ship." The analogy was accurate. Yorktown had simply not survived. It had been reproduced as the product of an assembly line with warlike morale. And now this product flew, fought, and threatened to dismantle the most daring naval offensive of the Japanese Empire. At 8:10 a.m., confirmation came. Japanese observers identified aircraft launched from a ship that exhibited characteristics of the Yorktown. The radio codes confirmed. What was a rumor became fact, and the fact turned into panic. Japanese confidence, built on immaculate equations, was beginning to crack under the pressure of the unforeseen. The MI plan, which had taken months to design, now had to be redone in minutes, under attack, with planes refueling on decks and multiple targets popping up on radar. But what caused more shock was not the reappearance of the Yorktown. That was what he stood for: the collapse of a worldview where precision and perfection guaranteed victory. The Americans did not play by these rules. They played with volume, with flexibility, with redundancy. With each ship lost, another was rebuilt. With each mistake, there was an adaptation. It was a war of elasticity. and Japan had bet on rigidity. Within seconds, American torpedo boats broke through the horizon line. They flew low, dangerously in coordinated formations. And it wasn't two squads. There were more, many more than anticipated. Japanese radar began to plot divergent routes, impossible to contain with the few fighters still on patrol. It was the beginning of what Nagumo would later call the minutes that decided the war. Because now the mistake was not just strategic, it was structural. And what was to come, in the next few hours, was not just an attack. It was a revelation. Because for the first time, Japan would realize that the real enemy was not an aircraft carrier. It was a system, and that system had just activated its most ruthless response. At 08:37 in the morning, the tactical lull in the Akagi Command Center was broken by a sequence of successive reports. Watchmen stationed in the observation towers of the Imperial Fleet reported a new wave of American planes coming from the southwest. But something was wrong. They were torpedo aircraft, similar to those that had attacked minutes earlier, but in greater numbers than expected. At first, the operators assumed a counting error, but the data was confirmed. There were more planes in the air than 2 American aircraft carriers could safely launch. The mathematics of Japanese doctrine, as precise as it is ruthless, began to fail. The first ironic whisper crossed the radio booth. Sanseikan ka? 3 aircraft carriers? That didn't make sense. It was not possible. And at the same time, it was happening. Inside Admiral Nagumo's decision-making center, intelligence officers, strategists, and radio operators looked at each other. The coordinates of the attack vectors matched launch points out of range of the 2 aircraft carriers that were supposed to be in the field. The radars, although limited, pointed to multiple attack formations converging from directions that did not correspond to previous patterns. The suspicion became a hypothesis, and the hypothesis within seconds imposed itself as an unavoidable reality. There was a 3rd American aircraft carrier in combat. The General Staff tried to resist the conclusion. The MI plan did not provide for this. The Imperial Navy's reports were categorical. The USS Yorktown had been neutralized in the Coral Sea. Replacing this certainty with doubt would imply reconfiguring the entire logic of the battle in real time. But doubt spread. A Japanese radio operator, while intercepting a short transmission between American fighters, heard the term "Red Leader from York." The term York echoed in the cockpit as a misperception, but it was clear, and he was known. A second report, coming from the easterly direction, reported that a new formation of diving bombers was approaching, with a pattern different from what had been previously recorded. The tactical code, the radar signature, the type of aircraft, everything indicated that they were not reinforcements from the already known units. It was a new air group. It was Yorktown. He was there, and it shouldn't be. The revelation was received as a break from reality. Japan had not only been deceived by misinformation, it had been betrayed by its own logic. The doctrine that built its decisions on immutable premises now faltered in the face of a variable that should never have returned to the battlefield. The Yorktown was, to the Japanese, an operational corpse. Its reappearance not only invalidated the plan, it exposed in full light the limitation of a strategic thinking that did not foresee improvisation as a weapon. The psychological effects of this revelation were immediate. Commanders hesitated. Fuel reserve calculations for subsequent missions were interrupted. The anti-aircraft artillery received conflicting orders. Some ships began to maneuver in opposite directions, attempting to recalibrate their defensive formations. A deck officer of the Kaga recorded in his diary, "Certainty had abandoned us. Now we were surrounded by questions." The crew, until then driven by an almost ceremonial confidence, began to face the horizon with a new feeling: uncertainty. And in war, uncertainty is the first step toward disorder. On the American side, the irony was palpable. The Yorktown, still deformed, operated with half the original crew, with patched systems, with ammunition hastily redistributed, but it was there, and its mere presence generated a disproportionate effect. Psychological disorganization. The ship did not have to win alone. It was enough to exist. It was enough to be in the place where, according to the enemy, he could not be. This was the real weapon of American industrial power, the ability to break the enemy's logic not only with force, but with operational impossibility. And here lies a fact little discussed in the strategy manuals of the time. While Japan operated with about 5,000 naval maintenance technicians throughout its navy, the United States at Pearl Harbor alone allocated more than 20,000 civilian professionals for emergencies. In sheer numbers, the ability to recover a ship in record time was not an exception. It was a policy, and Yorktown was his proof. If this data surprised you, leave your comment with the expression that best translates this shock. Unbelievable, shocking data, or simply, logistics wins. At 9:17 a.m., sirens sounded in the Akagi with unusual intensity. It wasn't just another attack. It was the collapse of a mental model. The Battle of Midway, planned to be the final blow against the U.S. Navy, turned into a battle for the survival of Japanese doctrine itself. And the planes that now dived over the Imperial aircraft carriers did not only carry explosives, it brought the confirmation that, from then on, nothing would follow the expected calculations. Because the war was no longer fought by those who agreed on the plan. It was won by those who could keep fighting even after the plan failed. At 10:24 a.m., on June 4, 1942, the sky over the Pacific looked like a blank canvas until it was torn apart by dozens of diving bombers. They came from 3 different directions, 3 distinct air groups, launched almost simultaneously from 3 aircraft carriers that, until days earlier, seemed incapable of forming a coordinated offensive. But the chaos generated the perfect storm. The Enterprise, the Hornet, and the unlikely Yorktown had, by an accidental alignment, reached the same point at the same time. The result was a window of vulnerability over the Japanese fleet, a 6-minute window. And in those 6 minutes, the course of the war in the Pacific was rewritten. The immediate target was Soryu, one of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers present at Midway. Its runway was loaded with rearmed and refueled planes. Bombs, jet fuel, dismantled torpedoes, all in a state of critical exposure. The Yorktown squad was the first to find him, flying in tight formation. With pilots who had trained together for less than 3 days, the SBD Dauntless bombers dived with devastating accuracy. 3 bombs hit the main deck. The first penetrated to the lower hangar. The second exploded over a formation of torpedo boats ready for launch. The third struck the rudder, locking the ship in a fatal turn. Within minutes, the Soryu was on fire, uncontrollable, doomed. But what the Japanese didn't know, and what few Americans would understand until much later, was what sustained each of those aircraft in the air. Those Dauntless weren't just attack machines. They were the product of a desperate recovery effort. They were armed with bombs hastily adjusted by newly remobilized technicians. They flew with calibrated controls on steel plates, glued with cross-welding and emergency insulation. Its pilots relied on elevators that had been tested for minutes, not hours. And even so, they got it right with a precision that would make any war manual seem obsolete. Each bomb that hit the Soryu bore invisibly the signature of the 1,400 civilian workers who had, days before, operated without manuals, without precedent, and often without sleep. It was as if, at that very moment, the energy of each hammer, each weld, each non-standard decision was being reciprocated. Japanese doctrine, which saw the battleship as a masterpiece of engineering, was now witnessing the destruction caused by planes launched from a patched platform, operating beyond its limit. And that was the new code of war, not that of refinement, but that of speed and adaptation. The Akagi and Kaga were hit soon after by squadrons from the Enterprise, but it was Yorktown's attack on Soryu that started the sequence, an attack that should not have existed, an air group that should not have been assembled, a ship that should not have sailed, and yet he was there, causing irreparable destruction to the center of Japanese naval power in the Pacific. The irony is as obvious as it is brutal. The reappearance of Yorktown not only turned Midway's tactical logic upside down, it embodied in that instant the collapse of Japanese logic about what was and was not possible in war. Japanese officers watching the columns of smoke rising from the Soryu were still trying to understand how the enemy had reacted so quickly, as he had had enough planes, how he had reorganized his forces, and why there was a 3rd aircraft carrier. What for them was an unsolvable puzzle for Americans was simply the natural consequence of having a system prepared for chaos. What the Japanese called improvisation, the Americans called Plan B. And when Plan B failed, along came C, and then D. American war was redundant by design. That's why it worked. Within just 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were out of action. The base of the attack on Midway was crumbling, and at the center of that reaction was Yorktown. Not the most powerful, not the youngest, but the most unlikely, because its very existence contradicted everything Japan believed about the timing, repair, and reach of American industry. The Soryu, designed with almost ceremonial precision, tipped under the weight of makeshift planes launched from a patched ship. Japanese doctrine had not provided that a ship could be put into combat within 72 hours, because in his logic, this was technical suicide. But for Americans, this was just another variable to be overcome with work. And now, faced with the flames on the horizon, Japan wasn't just fighting 3 aircraft carriers. It was fighting a culture of war based on urgency, mobilization, and the belief that the impossible is just a matter of scale. Amid the smoke and muffled sounds of the explosions, a message crossed the Yorktown radio. Target neutralized, returning. It was short, drought, but inside her there was something bigger. It was confirmation that an entire nation, from the shipyard to the deck, had participated in that moment. And what was yet to come would show that this was not Yorktown's last mission, but it would not be its salvation either. Because the Japanese, even at a disadvantage, still had the strength to react. And they would react. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, aboard the last Japanese aircraft carrier still operational, the Hiryu, watched the horizon with the eyes of someone who had lost everything but the duty to react. 3 of the 4 pillars of the Imperial Navy were burning, with planes destroyed, decks cracked, and hundreds of sailors missing at sea. The only chance to reverse course on that catastrophic morning lay in a quick, concentrated response. It was necessary to hit the enemy with symbolic force, not just strategic, and for that Yamaguchi chose his target with emotional precision. Yorktown, the same ship that had already been declared dead once, the same one who now dared to lead the attack. He needed to disappear. Definitely. The strike squad was launched urgently. Escort fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers were hastily assembled. The mission was clear: to incapacitate the aircraft carrier that was not supposed to exist. At 12:10 p.m., Yorktown lookouts detected the first silhouettes approaching. The attack alarm echoed through the deck for the 3rd time in less than 6 hours. But this time, the threat was lethal. 3 250-kilogram bombs hit the ship's hull in succession. The first exploded on the flight deck, opening a 12-meter crater. The second penetrated to the boiler house. The third fell on the command compartments, momentarily disrupting all communications. Black smoke, fires, power cut. Yorktown stopped. The scene was repeated, but there was a fundamental difference. On board, the crew was no longer the same as weeks before. Now, everyone knew that resisting wasn't just possible, it was expected. Damage control systems, reactivated with spare parts, began operating. Improvised water pumps drained flooded compartments. Industrial fans, removed from civilian sheds and hastily sold, expelled the smoke. External electrical cables installed on the side of the hull redirected energy to radars and anti-aircraft weapons. What was supposed to be the second and definitive end of Yorktown turned into yet another containment operation. This resistance didn't just save the ship, it protected the others. Because while Yorktown attracted the full attack of the Hiryu, the Enterprise and Hornet repositioned their formations, prepared new takeoffs, and evaded Japanese sights. The time purchased by Yorktown was not counted in minutes. It was counted in preserved squadrons, in intact crews, on targets that were not destroyed. The ship that should have been dead twice was now saving 2 others. It was again a functional cog, even if it collapsed. In parallel, on the other side of the ocean, American factories operated in 3 shifts. The production of ships, spare parts, and repair systems followed a pace that no other country could match. To give an exact measure of this imbalance, in 1942, the United States launched a new warship every 5 days. Germany, every 42. This disparity was not just a numerical difference. It was the invisible explanation behind American resilience. If this statistic impressed you, comment now with the expression that most represents you: absolute power, logistics wins, or shocking data. Back in the Pacific, the scene of the tilted Yorktown with dense smoke rising from the center of the deck generated the impression that the end had finally come. The Japanese observed from a long distance the damage caused. Preliminary reports indicated that the ship was out of action, perhaps already sinking. Again, the manuals were consulted, and again the logic was applied. An aircraft carrier in that condition would never return to battle. But this belief had failed before, and it was about to fail again, because while the Japanese celebrated the apparent success of the counterattack, a new wave of American planes was already positioning themselves on the decks of the Enterprise and Hornet. The time purchased by Yorktown had been sufficient. Within minutes, the last Japanese aircraft carrier, the Hiryu, would come into the crosshairs, and what followed was less of a battle and more of a consequence, because war at that point was no longer fought for tactical superiority. It was decided by a silent but definitive factor: the time it takes to return to combat. And in this regard, the Japanese were playing against their own history. At 2:45 p.m. on June 4th, the war in the Pacific took a turn that, ironically, was not determined by air superiority, weaponry, or technology, but by an error of interpretation. The Japanese pilots, upon returning from the first raid on the Yorktown, reported something that completely confused the command of the Imperial fleet. The stricken ship was still operating. The columns of smoke had subsided. The deck, partially damaged, seemed already functional. Aircraft were being repositioned. On the ground, the ship that should be dead was responding. The confusion became paralyzing. Contradictory reports reached Admiral Yamaguchi. For some, it was a new American aircraft carrier, which appeared out of nowhere. For others, it was simply a repeat of the initial mistake. The Yorktown had not sunk before, and neither now. With no time for deeper analysis, a decision was made. The target would be the same again. What the Japanese did not know, and should never find out exactly, was that Yorktown's vision of operational continuity was a direct result of the American doctrine of redundancy and repair. Instead of splitting up to attack the remaining American carriers now clearly identified, the Japanese concentrated their second attack exactly where it mattered least, and that was the fatal mistake. Logic dictated that it was better to ensure the destruction of a certain target than to risk a diffuse offensive. But this logic depended on incorrect data. The Yorktown was, again, an operational ghost, a target that, having survived too long, seemed multiplied in the eyes of the enemy. While the Japanese torpedo boats reorganized for a new assault, the bombers of the Enterprise and the Hornet were already in the air, in search of the last Japanese ship still functional, the Hiryu, and they would find him. At 5:03 p.m., the attack was launched. 4 450-kilogram bombs hit the deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier. One exploded between the aircraft elevators. Another penetrated into the engine room. The Hiryu, until then a symbol of the final resistance, now burned like the others. In less than 24 hours, Japan would lose its 4 main aircraft carriers, 4 naval engineering gems reduced to steaming hulls. And all of this, ultimately, began with a miscalculation. The decision to rebomb Yorktown was not just a tactical choice. It was the collapse of an intelligence system that operated on the basis of visual certainties and inflexible technical interpretations. Japan believed in absolute truths. If a ship sank, it doesn't come back. If he is hit twice, he is out of combat. This doctrine, refined in decades of naval tradition, had no room for the idea of accelerated repair, improvised adaptation, or, worse, the hypothesis of an enemy who thought otherwise. The Americans did not repair ships to restore their glory. They would see to it so that they would shoot again. And Yorktown fired. And he survived. Twice. The destruction of the Hiryu was therefore not just an aerial victory. It was the final sentence of a battle fought also in the field of logic. While the Japanese processed information as if they were dealing with a static board, the Americans turned each turn of combat into a new industrial movement. For the United States, war was not made of honor. It was made of steel, of patched cables, of exhausted crews who operated soggy decks with the engines still on fire. It was based on the question, how much time do we have? And never with the answer, how much time would be ideal? From a strategic point of view, the second attack on Yorktown produced no real effect. The ship had already been evacuated preventively. The propulsion system had been decommissioned. The damage did not worsen significantly. The attack therefore consumed planes, fuel, and crews in a phantom objective. an operational error that was born of a visual illusion, and of a doctrinal arrogance that did not allow us to accept the impossible. This moment marks the definitive turning point of the Battle of Midway. From here, the tide turns not by positional advantage or fighting strength, but by disintegration of logic. Japanese doctrine collapses because it insists on applying the parameters of traditional warfare to an enemy operating at an assembly line pace. The Japanese sought honor. The Americans were looking for efficiency. And efficiency in this case won. At 7:00 p.m. that same day, the Hiryu lay motionless on the sea, unable to launch planes, unable to recover those who remained. The silence on the deck contrasted with the roar of the flames still alive. A ship designed to last for decades had been reduced to wreckage in less than 10 hours. And all because Japan decided to attack the same ship twice, and left the other two intact long enough to fight back with full force. On the other side of the world, Germany watched the movements in the Pacific with restrained attention. His generals studied the battles on maps and intelligence reports, trusting that discipline, accuracy, and consolidated doctrine would be enough to face any enemy. But what they did not understand yet was that they were facing an opponent who did not respect the manuals, an opponent who would rather win than be right, a country that could lose a ship in the morning, repair it in the afternoon, and return it to combat the next day. Modern warfare, they would realize too late, belonged to those who knew how to move with speed, improvisation, and steel under pressure. And if there was still any doubt about who had understood this first, the debris floating on Midway, and the smoke that still rose from the Hiryu, left the answer visible on the horizon. Because while Japan still believed in rules, America was already operating under results. And the next chapter would show how far this logic could lead. In weld-drowned workshops, surrounded by the smell of oil and the incessant noise of hammers, Pearl Harbor workers operated in a different time zone than the war. To them, the battlefield wasn't the ocean. It was the hold of a ship, the charred engine, the structure warped by explosions. But in that early June 1942, when the base's loudspeakers began reporting the first results of the Battle of Midway, something changed. They stopped. For seconds, maybe minutes. And they listened. One by one, the names of the Japanese aircraft carriers were announced as destroyed. But it was only upon hearing that the squadron of the USS Yorktown had sunk the Soryu that the connection was made. That ship, which had barely kept afloat when they had received it, was now an offensive weapon. An old electrician, still in his uniform smeared with grease, looked down at his hands. "I was the one who passed the cable of the central tower," he said in a low voice. The war, at that moment, had become personal. Later accounts document the raw emotion in the shipyards. It was not a celebration. It was astonishment, the kind of wonder that only occurs when the impossible comes true, and you realize you helped build it. Many of the workers who participated in the recovery of the Yorktown had never set foot on a combat ship. They did not know their tactical schemes, their formations, much less the impact of a torpedo. But they understood something else: urgency. They understood that when an officer shouted 72 hours, it wasn't a metaphor. It was survival. And every minute saved with a fast welder, every tool adapted to fit in the wrong place, every shift bent, it saved something much greater than time. Among the testimonies collected years later, that of Charlie Nakamura, grandson of Japanese immigrants and chief welder of Dry Dock 2, stands out. He worked 2 full nights replacing plates in the stern hull, with patches so improvised that they had to be held together by civilian bolts, taken from construction scaffolding. Years later, he met a Yorktown crew member at an event in San Diego. The man, now retired, took a piece of charred metal. "This one fell into my accommodation," he said, "but it withstood the impact. The weld was crooked but firm." Nakamura just nodded. That piece of steel was his work and his signature on history. Yorktown was the result of 1,400 anonymous hands. The 22-year-old electrician who turned the radar panel back on. The shipyard cook who improvised a functional kitchen in the ship's hold. The civil engineer who adapted construction timber to reinforce aircraft elevators. None of them fired a gun. None of them saw the open sea. But they all participated in the destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, without leaving the island. And when post-war statistics revealed the numbers, the scale of the industrial miracle was revealed. For every soldier in combat, the United States moved 9 rear workers. 9. A proportion that alone already pointed to the outcome of the conflict. More than an operational victory, Midway was a human triumph. Not mythological heroes, but workers, technicians, and improvisers. Of people who never expected a medal, and whose stories often only came to light decades later, in kept letters, in yellowed photographs, in old tools, kept as a reminder of something they themselves did not know how to explain. Because there was no script, there was no plan, just the order, make it work, and that was enough. If there's one image that sums up this chapter, it's that of a sailor back at Pearl Harbor, still in his oil-soaked suit, hugging the welder who had reinforced his cabin days earlier. Neither of them knew the other's name, but they knew exactly what they had done. Together, one had pulled the trigger, the other had ensured that the trigger went off, and this invisible union is what brought down the Soryu, the Kaga, the Akagi, and the Hiryu. Not only the drivers, not only the generals, but all of them. It is this kind of war that history rarely shows. The war seen from below, view of the metal floor of the shipyard, view of the calloused hand holding a tool, not a rifle, view from the point where the wheels of victory are made, one by one in the dark, under pressure. And it is this war, often forgotten, that changed the course of the world in just 3 days. But Yorktown's impact wasn't over yet, because even though it was damaged, even though it slowly sank after the second attack, it continued to serve. Their radios still transmitted, his guns were still firing, and its mere presence on Japanese radar still confused, divided, and delayed critical decisions. And in the center of this confusion, a last act of resistance was being prepared, coming from the water, the final torpedo, the struggle to keep the hull afloat, and the moment when the ship, already empty, decided to sink as a symbol. Because even the sinking of the Yorktown was not a defeat, it was a warning, and this warning was about to be understood by those who least expected it. Between the ashes of Midway and the smoky reports that crossed the sea to Tokyo, something began to crystallize behind the scenes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The bitter realization that the loss was not just ships. In the journals of Admiral Ugaki, deputy commander of the combined fleet, there is a brief but loaded note. The enemy thinks differently. Admiral Fukudome, chief strategist for naval operations, was even more incisive in an internal memo. The mistake was not one of courage, but of design. What these men were trying to verbalize was something bigger than tactics. It was the collapse of a paradigm. Up to that point, Japan believed that moral and technical superiority was the linchpin of any fair combat. Every movement of the fleet was ritualized, every maneuver measured accurately. A ship, when damaged, should return with honor to the dock, be restored with care, regain its dignity before returning to sea. It was an almost spiritual vision of war, where steel was treated with reverence and time obeyed a ceremonial rhythm. On the other side of the Pacific, Americans were following another gospel. Their doctrine was not based on honor, it was based on efficiency. If the hull still floats, it struggles. If the turret still rotates, it fires. If the plane still flies, it takes off, even with borrowed spare parts. This brutally pragmatic philosophy is what emerged at Midway. It wasn't pretty, but it was deadly. And this mental asymmetry was the real watershed. While the Japanese spent hours perfecting attacks with almost choreographed discipline, the Americans piled up mistakes, adjustments, and improvisations, and won by insistence, not elegance. Yorktown wasn't a masterpiece. It was a sign, an announcement that the world had changed. And Japan, with all its doctrinal rigor, was reading the wrong manual. The contrast becomes even more evident when we look at naval repair procedures. A Japanese destroyer, upon returning with medium damage, went through a technical inspection cycle that took between 3 and 5 days, just for evaluation. After that, a complete restoration began, respecting the original standards of the shipyard. Each screw needed to be in the exact place. Each livery was to correspond to the official color of the fleet. At Pearl Harbor, this same process would take 6 hours. If a radar worked with excessive vibration, it was welded to a wooden support. If a support beam had been lost, repurposed railroad tracks were used. There was no manual. There was a result. And that result, proven at Midway, began to erode the confidence of the Japanese leadership. Over the next few months, the term Yokotan, a phonetic corruption of Yorktown, began to circulate among Japan's marine engineers. It was used not as a ship name but as slang for functional impossible. When a component seemed unrecoverable, Some technician would say, make a Yokoton. The irony was brutal. What represented the collapse of his doctrine now became a silent model among those who knew that war did not expect perfection. This discomfort crossed hierarchies. Younger officers, exposed to technical reports from the enemy, began to admire in secret the efficient brutality of the Americans. And while the admirals sought to maintain the facade of control, the truth was already running behind the scenes. They weren't just facing another navy, they were facing another century. Modern war, as they would realize with pain, had ceased to be a duel of honor. It had become a competition of logistics, rhythm, replacement. The United States had more than 150 shipyards operating in 1942. Japan, less than 30. American merchant ship production that year was nearly 1,800 units. Japan produced just over 150. The number doesn't lie. The war was being decided not in the Pacific, but in factories in the interior of Ohio, in industrial ports of California, in small workshops of Wisconsin. Each makeshift weld was a response to the doctrine of perfectionism, and each victory, a silent denial of the ceremonial. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content on how logistics won where honor failed. What the Japanese dailies began to record, with growing unease, was the birth of a war incompatible with the one they had trained to fight. Their ships were works of art, its pilots, trained for years, his tactics, precise as a sword. But all this now faced an enemy that operated like a hammer, less refined but infinitely more resistant. And when they realized this, they realized that Midway wasn't just a defeat, it was a harbinger, a warning that the war, from now on, would not be fought with ceremonial katanas, but with wrenches. The next American move was already underway, a project that would make the Yorktown's reappearance seem like a simple rehearsal. One name began to echo among spreadsheets, technical meetings, and naval orders: Essex. And what it represented would make Japan realize that the speed seen at Midway was just the beginning of a production they could never achieve. What began as a desperate maneuver at Pearl Harbor, with the unlikely reappearance of the Yorktown, became a dress rehearsal for the most powerful doctrine of World War II, war as an industrial product. Beginning in June 1942, the United States abandoned any remnant of traditional warfare and plunged into a new kind of conflict, a conflict where the ability to multiply, not conserve, was the key to winning. The Yorktown, repaired in 72 hours, served as a symbol and catalyst. The philosophy that rebuilt it became a national guideline, and what was once the exception has become standard. Liberty ships were born, medium freighters built in pre-assembled blocks with unthinkable delivery times. The record was a ship delivered in 4 days and 15 hours. In parallel, the Willow Run plant in Michigan began producing B-24 bombers at a rate of 1 per hour. An entire plane every 63 minutes assembled by civilian workers, many of them women, with no military or technical background. Production was no longer a line. It was an uninterrupted cycle, a steel conveyor and bolts turning day and night without pause, without hesitation. Meanwhile, military engineering broke the boundaries of physics with the Manhattan Project. In just 3 years, the U.S. went from absolute zero in nuclear technology to building the most destructive weapon in human history. The contrast could not be more stark. While the Germans invested scarce resources in experimental weapons like the V-2, the Americans followed brutal math. If it works, multiply. If not, abandon it. It was a logic that cut bureaucracy, ignored aesthetics, and trampled on traditionalism. Yorktown, Liberty, B-24, Jeep, Sherman. The names changed, but the essence was the same. Production, repetition, presence. Every new piece of equipment that came out of the factories was less an individual part and more like a cog in a colossal engine. General Eisenhower would later declare, "It was American industry that won this war. The soldiers were the arms, but the engine was in the rear." Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, used even drier words. "Our most accurate weapon is not the cannon, it's the ability to replace the cannon tomorrow." And he did not exaggerate. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced more than 300,000 planes, 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and more than 5,000 ships. This wasn't arsenal, it was mass reproduction. The world had not seen anything like it, and in 1942, in the heat of the Battle of Midway, Japan still did not understand that Yorktown was only the first ghost of this new era. Testimonies from civil engineers who participated in the war shipyards reveal how this turn was more mental than technical. One of the supervisors at the San Francisco Naval Shipyard reported that, after the Yorktown case, higher orders began to use the phrase combat time as the official planning unit. If something could not be done within the range of an air raid, it was not feasible. The entire logic of production was resignified to serve the moment. Improvisation is no longer an exception and has become celebratory. Assembly lines were adapted to accept non-standard parts. Civilian machines were converted into war tooling in days. And the manuals became just suggestions. The doctrine of make it work has expanded beyond the technical field. It has become language, mentality, state policy. Universities began to collaborate directly with the Department of Defense. Workers were trained by short films and verbal instructions. Everything was faster, more direct, more functional. A General Motors engineer, when asked about the accuracy of a new armored model, replied coldly, "It doesn't have to last. You just need to get to the enemy line." It was this objectivity that moved the conflict now. Beauty had been replaced by utility. For the Japanese and Germans accustomed to worshiping detail, care, millimetric calculation, this avalanche seemed like a collapse of values. But it was, in fact, the birth of a new paradigm. For the first time in modern military history, the concept of scale has become more lethal than that of quality. An average mass-produced bomber was worth more than a flawless fighter delivered late. A hastily welded but launched vessel on time weighed more heavily in the balance of war than a luxury cruiser still in trials. And while the enemy was lost in technical decisions, the Americans followed the maxim that had saved Yorktown. You don't have to be ready. It needs to be there. The mentality that was born in that shipyard in May 1942 spread as a doctrine not only in the armed forces, but in the soul of the nation. It was the triumph of the useful over the ideal, from the present over the future, from the necessary over the perfect. And this, more than bombs or aircraft carriers, was what transformed the United States into the military power that would cross oceans, break continents, and define the course of the century. But the impact of production was not limited to factories. It was already felt on the battlefields. And in the waters of the Pacific, as the Yorktown slowly sank, another ship took its place, bigger, more modern, and even faster to produce. Your name? USS Essex. The real American response to the war of attrition had just set sail. At the heart of the U.S. Navy's training programs, between navigation modules, combat simulations, and evacuation protocols, is a must-attend class that spans generations. The case of the USS Yorktown, not as an isolated feat, but as a doctrinal pillar. Every sailor, every officer, every naval engineer learns what it means to make it work in wartime. Modern damage control manuals devote entire chapters to that early morning of May 27, 1942, when the 72-hour order was issued at Pearl Harbor. One learns not only the techniques applied, but above all the thought that guided them. Readiness is worth more than symmetry. A naval repair system that was previously based on deadlines, expertise, and validations is now governed by one principle. Time is not a resource. It is a target. This doctrine was named Damage Control Doctrine, but what it really symbolizes is a philosophical shift. After Midway, all American ships began to incorporate integrated damage control centers, decentralized decision structures, with the power to cut power, flood compartments, weld structures in emergencies, all operated by crews trained to act without waiting for orders. Machines have adapted to the new thinking, but more importantly, so do the people. Because the lesson of Yorktown was not just technical, it was moral. In extreme scenarios, action is worth more than ideal. After the war, the Bureau of Ships reviewed more than 900 maintenance procedures based on the improvisations recorded during the Yorktown repairs. What would previously be considered technical insubordination has become an emergency norm. Side reinforcement welds, external communication tubes, reused parts. Everything became part of official manuals. In the Korean War, American destroyers applied these same practices under fire. In Vietnam, Riverboats were adapted in hours with improvised kits directly inspired by the contingency culture inherited from World War II. And later, in the Persian Gulf, ships like the USS Cole, after being attacked, resisted not because of their armor, but because their crews knew what to do when all else fails. And that they learned from the Yorktown. Outside the military field, this doctrine overflowed. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, adopted similar principles after Hurricane Katrina, drawing inspiration from the concept of minimum viable operational capability, an idea directly derived from systems created on the decks of Yorktown. In situations of logistical collapse, the priority is not to restore the system to the ideal. It is to make it operate with what is left. Field hospitals, mobile power stations, emergency communication networks, all follow in some way the principles created by a makeshift shipyard in May 1942. The U.S. Humanitarian Task Force, which works on earthquakes, tsunamis, and pandemics, also carries this mindset. Its modular operating centers were designed based on the same load distribution logic, energy autonomy, and functional modularity that engineers hastily applied to the Yorktown's hull. Each module can work in isolation, be patched, relocated, replaced, because it's not the appearance that defines effectiveness. It is the persistence of functioning. And this, more than strategy, is an institutionalized philosophy. In today's Navy, there's a maxim repeated informally in classrooms and on decks. If Yorktown could come back, anything can work. It is a reminder that perfection is not expected when the clock counts in minutes, that success rarely comes from strict obedience, and almost always from the courage to act outside of protocol when protocol no longer serves. The military's own doctrine of mission-capable status, which defines levels of operational readiness based on the essentials, not the ideal, is a direct inheritance of this vision. There are records that during the Iraq War, field engineers in special operations carried a condensed copy of the Yorktown-inspired Damage Control Manual. And in 2004, during a conference of the Pacific Naval Command, a U.S. admiral declared, "The difference between Yorktown and most war plans was simple. It existed, and that was enough." This sentence sums up the doctrine better than any regulation. War does not reward the perfect. It rewards the present. The irony of the story is that this all started with a Japanese mistake, a misinterpreted report, a doctrinal assumption, and the belief that a badly damaged ship would not return to service for months. They calculated everything, except the American mindset. The invisible answer did not come from a new weapon. It came from a crooked weld, from a non-standard plate, from a crew that believed that a ship limping on the front line was better than a monument to engineering standing in the shipyard. If you've come this far, it's because you understand that details change history. If this reconstruction made you see the power behind the urgency, like and subscribe. Each new video is a weld on the shell of memory, because what happened next remains to be seen. When the Yorktown, even though already doomed, bought time for the next generation of aircraft carriers to take to sea with another promise. They wouldn't have to go back, because now, the enemy knew who he was fighting. The USS Yorktown didn't just return to the war because of welds, cables, and rivets. He came back because there was, behind every repair, a silent moral understanding that there was something bigger at stake than the structure of a ship. During those 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, no one apologized for the improvisation. No one questioned whether the peace was ideal, because everyone knew that perfection doesn't save lives. Readiness does. What happened there was not just a victory for the technique. It was a moral uprising of a society that, when confronted with the impossible, chose to do, rather than calculate. Yorktown carried the steel of the industry, yes, but it also carried the sweat of men who were not remembered in medals, the reasoning of engineers who slept on the floor of the shipyard, the urgency of captains who knew that every hour stopped cost lives at sea. In the end, the ship that should no longer exist launched planes that changed the war, and it did so with dented irons, partially functional systems, and an absolute faith that working was enough. The real U.S. weapon at Midway was not a bomber, not a torpedo, not even the Yorktown itself. It was the concept he represented, that freedom of thought, speed of execution, and union between classes can turn chaos into advantage. And that's why, even today, so many years later, when an American naval officer teaches damage control to a young recruit, He doesn't just talk about valves or pressures. He speaks of character. Because the 1-400 workers who brought Yorktown to life weren't just saving a ship. They were affirming, with silence and weld, that a free people, when they believe that something needs to be done, does not wait for orders. And this is the force that no enemy doctrine has ever been able to calculate. But there is still one last chapter. Because even though the Yorktown won its third battle against time, it would still face its biggest test, the day it would actually sink. And even in this inevitable end, it would carry with it the seed of rebirth. The USS Yorktown rests today at a depth of almost 5,000 meters, in the dark silence of the Pacific, where time does not erase, but preserves. Its metal plates still show the patches, the marks of running welds, the exposed cables, the desperate solutions that have become doctrine. He sank, yes, but only after he had won his last mission, the most symbolic. At Midway, Yorktown didn't just defy time. He challenged an entire war philosophy. He showed that modern warfare would not be won by those who calculate more, but by those who do more, faster, with what they have. In the end, Japan did not lose by tactical inferiority or lesser bravery. He lost because he believed that the enemy followed the same rules of honor, perfection, and ritual. But I was facing an adaptive machine, driven by urgency and steel, which transformed each crisis into innovation. The lesson is universal. Volume trumps tactics. Logistics shapes the strategy. And in a long war, those who can improvise with speed win. Years after the war, a Luftwaffe officer would bitterly admit, "We were not defeated by planes. We were defeated by trucks." If you value this type of research and the search for historical truths that do not fit in school textbooks, support the channel with your like and subscribe. This helps us to continue bringing real stories with precision and respect. Comment below what was the most surprising fact of this journey, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Because the next story is already ready. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.